Good evening. Extend a warm welcome to each of you who's joined us today, both members and friends of INTAC, and a very warm welcome to Sriram Venkatakrishnan, the speaker of this evening. INTAC, an acronym for the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, was set up 36 long years ago in 1984 as a non-profit organization with a vision to spearhead heritage awareness and conservation in India and to protect India's vast, built, cultural, intangible, and natural heritage. At INTAC, our programs have been covering aspects of culture, arts, crafts, traditions, and local heritage. Today, we bring the spotlight on an aspect of Carnatic music. December and music season are synonymous for Madras. This year, thanks to the pandemic, we are sadly missing the season that we look forward to all year. Is it only the live concerts that we are missing? Certainly not. It's the lecdems, meeting people, discussing schedules, Sabha hopping, meeting the music regulars, including NRIs, and of course the canteen food that add to the buzz and aura of the season. Thank you, Sriram, for being here today and giving us a virtual kickstart to the virtual December season. As the cliche goes, Sriram.V hardly needs an introduction. He's very well known for his writings, talks, and his heritage walks and tours. His two areas of passion are Carnatic music and the history of Madras. Sriram has authored several books in both these subjects. On music, he's written Carnatic Summer, Life of 20 Great Exponents, and Devadasi and the Saint, the life and times of Bangalore Nagaratnama. He has also co-authored Fourscore and More, The History of the Music Academy, Madras, and a biography of Shemangudi Srinivas Iyer. On the history of the city, he has written Historic Residences of Chennai and about the Fort St. George, as well as several corporate histories. He is the editor of Madras Musings, a city-centric fortnightly dedicated to history and heritage, launched initially by late Mr. S. Muttaya. Sriram is a regular columnist in The Hindu. The heritage walks and tours he conducts are popular and have drawn wide audiences. He was convener of INTAC Chennai chapter in 2012 and 2013. He is currently one of the secretaries of the Music Academy Madras, in which capacity he is the convener of its annual conference. Today we are happy that Sriram is here to speak about an aspect of the history of Carnatic music, that is the search for a suitable concert venue. Over to Sriram. Welcome.
Thank you, Sujata, for that introduction. And thank you so much, friends, for being here to listen to this talk. A great hug to Tara, whom I see after a long time on screen, if not in person. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting each other in a long while now. And so I'll start with that. The story that I have put together is basically not from an architect's point of view, but it is more from Rasika's point of view. I am taking into account the various writings that people have put together over the years on their experiences of listening to performances of Carnatic music in this city where we all live and which is today considered to be the cultural capital as far as South Indian classical music is concerned. But I would like to begin with a little description, which is much earlier to what we recognize today as the colonial city of Chennai. The question of a venue for classical music is something that is defined right from very, very early times. And if you look at the Sangeeta Ratnakara, which is the 12th century work that all of us begin our history of South Indian music from, history of Indian music from, to be frank, just not South Indian music. There is a wonderful description of what a venue for music should be like in the time that Sharngadeva wrote the Sangeeta Ratnakara. And he says that the brilliant multicolored dancing hall must be decorated with many flowers. It must be rich with various awnings and adorned with jeweled pillars. There, the president must occupy the beautiful Simhasana. To his left, the members of the harem, and to his right, the chieftains. Behind the chieftains should be the secretary of the treasury. Near them are scholars well versed in music and in the arts, clever in the various styles and Vedic lore. Poets of aesthetic taste are also here. In the center of the scholars should be seated honored physicians and astrologers. On the right side is the assemblage of ministers. There itself are to be seated the chiefs of the army and other men. Men and women of aesthetic taste should be around the members of the harem and in front of the king, the president of the assembly. Behind the king are to be girls full of beauty and youthfulness, carrying beautiful chauris, making the minds of the people blissful through the jingling sound of their bangles. Sitting on the left side of the king in front are the composers of songs, storytellers, bards, scholars, flatterers clever in praising, and others clever in different kinds of song. Then the attendants are to be seated around them. The bodyguards of the king should stand on all sides with weapon in their hands. Seating the audience thus, the king witnesses the dance and the music. It is not very different from an environment that an auditorium like the Music Academy or the Tamil Isai Sangam conjures up even today. So you've got the front row, you've got the important people, you've got the artists in front, you've got the Boy Scouts on the sides, then you've got the various people. It's an assemblage of scholars, of people who like music, and so on and so forth. So this has not changed from the 12th century, the fundamental requirement of a venue. And then in the 15th century, 16th century, you have a beautiful description by Domingo Pais of his visit to the dancing hall of King Krishnadevaraya in Vijayanagar, Hampi. And there again, you find that the way he talks about the venue is not very different from what Sharngadeva has said or what we have today. So the fundamental requirements are essentially the same over the years. You have a venue, you have a set of musicians who needed to perform, but the environment and the methods by which we have presented the music to the public has changed considerably over the years. I think we'll need to mute all the other participants. There's a lot of noise from somebody. Yeah. So if you look at the, sadly for us, the history of Chennai remains largely undocumented after the time of the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Cholas. And after that, we have no idea what happened to this entire region. There's a huge jump and gap in our history till the arrival of the colonials. And there is a huge debate. There are people who say that Madras and Chennai were well-established villages, if not towns, before the colonials came. Then there are others who talk about, some of them having been very prosperous cities, but there are no descriptions of all that. But we do know that during the time of the Cholas, the Tiruvattriyur temple, for instance, was a great venue for performances. And there were music and dance performances as documented in the inscriptions in this temple. In fact, this is one unique temple where you have a continuous history starting from the time of the Pallavas and coming right up to the time of the East India Company. So this is a shrine which takes you through, including the gaps, the Vijayanagar Empire and so on. But during the time of the Cholas, there is a very clear description of an award ceremony for dancers, where they are given this award called the Thalai Kolli, which again is an award that is buttressed by the Silapadikaram, where they talk about dancers getting this kind of a recognition. And it talks about an assemblage where scholars came together, the king was present, and the dancer performed, and she was given this title of Ainutru Talai Kolli. What that signifies, we don't know, but it definitely was a great recognition for a performer. So there again, it was from what we see today of this temple. And this pavilion that I have put up for you is almost 400 years after the time that I talked to you about the inscription. But perhaps the nature of the performance or the venue did not really change all that much. It was essentially a pavilion, open air, and where a small group of people must have got together. In my opinion, and I am not saying that this is substantiated by any other inscription or anything of that kind, but in my opinion, perhaps the number of people in the audience could not have been more than 50 or 60 or at most 100, because A, there would have been a problem of visibility, and two, there would definitely have been a problem of audibility of the music that was being presented, even though the surrounding ambient noise would have been negligible in that era. But it must have been an open air performance in a pavilion like the one that we see even today in the Tyagaraja temple. And then we come to the time of the East India Company and the founding of what we today recognize as the colonial city of Madras. And from the writings of the company, that is the company consultation records, more importantly, from the diary of the Dubash Anandarangam Pillai, who was living in Pondicherry and who's left behind a wonderful day-to-day account of his life in that city, we realized that music and dance was very much a part and parcel of daily activity as far as the company and the Dubashes were concerned. It was very important for musicians and dancers to accompany the retinue of principal residents of the city on certain occasions. And Anandarangam Pillai continuously refers to Melam, he refers to Devadasis, he refers to Padagars, and he says that whenever Duplay went out in procession for something, or whenever representatives of Chanda Sahib came, all of these people were present on those occasions. But when he talks about performances, he very rarely, in fact, he never mentions performance in an enclosed space. He always says that the music and the dance performance happened in the Totem. So he had a garden which was outside Pondicherry town, to which musicians and dancers would come, and that is where the performances would happen. In fact, he very clearly documents a, an opera or a champu which is composed on him, and that is staged in his presence and in the presence of his guests. That always happens in a totem. So it happens in an open space where clearly it was a very enjoyable environment to be in when, you didn't have things like air conditioning and all that. It must have been a cool time of the evening with plenty of trees around. And that is when the performances happened. And once again, we mustn't forget that the ambient noise was negligible at that point, except when guns were booming out from the fort. And if you read Anandarangam Pillai, you realize that Duplay had guns booming out of the fort at every odd hour, whether it was to brush his teeth or to eat or whatever. All the time, Birangigal veditana, gundu potargal. This happens all the time. But I'm sure despite all that, it must have been a wonderful experience to have performances out in the open. Now, what of Madras? If you look at the manuscript of Sarvadeva Vilasa, which is a Sanskrit work of the late 18th, early 19th century, it talks about a set of Dubashes and the musicians and dancers in their retinue. It's basically structured as a conversation between two scholars who have come to the city, and they describe the city in terms of its prominent residents and in terms of the great scholars, musicians, dancers, and patrons who reside over here. And most of the soirees, when they happen in coconut groves or in gardens. There are very few, there are hardly any references, in fact, to performances happening in an enclosed space. So it would appear that in the early years of Madras city, performances in the open, but in private gardens or in temples where once again there was plenty of natural air and wind, and the sound was just absorbed by the surroundings. That kind of an environment is where much of the performances happened. We also realized that the audiences were very, very small. They were not huge numbers. uh, Later descriptions would add exaggerations. So if you look at a 20th century Tamil work on what happened in the 19th century or the 18th century, they'll say, "பதினாயிரம் பேர்கள் உட்கார்ந்து கேட்டார்கள்." Now, if பதினாயிரம் பேர்கள், if they sat and listened, 10,000 people were able to listen to a music performance where there was no artificial amplification, how did they manage it? We have, it is not possible at all. It is very unlikely that audiences of that kind would have existed. Surprisingly, while we had open air performances over here, in the princely courts of Tanjabur, in places like Ramanathapuram, in Shivaganga, performances were happening in enclosed environments, even in Thiruvananthapuram, for that matter, where Maharaja Swati Tirunal was the ruler and he gave a huge fillip to classical music. You have this wonderfully designed Navaratri Mantapam, where once again, to a very small audience, if you go to the Navaratri Mantapam, not more than 150 people can actually be seated inside that auditorium. And on top, on the roof, there is a set of upturned pots of various circumferences, which are all looking downwards from a platform on the roof. That actually provided the amplification. And for a long period of time, there existed a set of technicians who would come and take care of those pots and who would adjust them depending upon the musician who was going to perform below. And that would ensure that there was sufficient amplification for 150 people to listen. Later, those pots just became museum pieces because people forgot what they signified. And today, the Navaratri Mantapam depends upon artificial amplification. And now, of course, the numbers have gone up. So people sit outside the Navaratri Mantapam and also listen. So it's not restricted just to the people inside. On the other hand, if you go to the Sangeeta Mahal in the Tanjabur Palace, what is very interesting is that the structure was probably built during the Nayak times and then greatly embellished by people like Sarfoji. Now, Sarfoji himself was very open to European influences, but if the Nayaks gave the basic structure, then it would appear to indicate that in Tanjavur we had awareness of what it was to build a proper auditorium for music performances. I am not very certain if the structure that we see today, how much of it is actually from the Nayak era and how much of it is from Sarfoji, and what has been very ill-advised modernization of that auditorium. But what you can see is that just like in the opera houses, there is a set of boxes on an upper level, and in the lower level, in the actual floor of the auditorium, the common people would sit. In the upper level, the members of the royal family would be seated, some in front and some behind latticed screens, and they would be able to witness the performance that was going on stage. And it appears to be, when you look at it today, it can definitely seat around 200 or 250 people, perhaps because it was enclosed and it could, the sound could carry. But even with very poor modern amplification, which the hall now has, the acoustics are of a fairly high order in that venue. Despite the best efforts of modern day engineers to finish off what Sarfoji had done, his technology appears to have survived to a great extent. In 2003, I don't know, 2004, I think, we organized a performance of Vishaka Hari in that particular venue. And it was wonderful to just sit there and listen to that Harikatha performance because of the way the sound traveled and, the way that venue was constructed. So here in Madras, you had open air auditoriums, and there we appear to have had closed door structures. The tendency of having music performances in the open appears to have continued right till the beginning years of the 20th century. So this is a photograph of a village, of an 18th century village called Colletspet. This is now called Kaladipetta. And when you go there, they'll say that Ramalinga Swamigaloda Kal Pattathinaal இந்த இடத்துக்கு காலடிப்பேட்டைன்னு பேரு. but that is not true. It was created in the 18th century by a British governor called Joseph Collett, and so it's called Collett's Pet. And Collett, for his assistant or writer, a man called Veeraraghava Brahmana, this temple was created. This is called the Kalyana Varadaraja Swami Kovil of Collett's Pet. And in the 20th, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a very extraordinarily musically gifted family that lived in Collett's Pet. Three sons, and all three were destined to become great in the world of Carnatic music. The first was K.V. Srinivasa Iyengar, who became more a writer and a publisher, who published several works on Tyagaraja and his compositions and all that, though he lived for a very short while. He passed away in the 1920s. His younger brother was Tiger Vardacharya, who was not only a performer, but was an academician, became head of department of three different music, or actually four, I think. If you look at the Teachers College of Music, the Department of Music, University of Madras, the Tamil, the Annamalai University, and then Kalakshetra as well. So four different institutions. And his younger brother, who went by the name of Veena Krishnamacharya, who actually composed songs on this particular temple. They are called the Padmapuri Varada compositions. And Tiger has, in a radio talk given in the 1940s, left behind a beautiful description of the way Collett's Pet Temple served as a venue for the performing arts. He talks about Nagaswaram performances happening here. He talks about Devadasi's dances. He talks about musical dramas brought by itinerant performing companies that would perform in this particular forecourt that you see over here, and how this environment played a huge role in shaping the musical thought and evolution of himself and of his brothers. Now, if Tiger's account is on one side, you also have another account written by Seshachalam Chetty of Curzon and Company. You all know, you must have all heard of Curzon and Company, the great furniture manufacturer makers. Now, Curzon and Company, the Seshachalam Chetty writes that among the Arya Vaishya community, this Collett's Pet was considered to be a kind of a summer retreat or a weekend retreat because it was full of trees. And they all built their weekend houses over here, and they used to come here, and they would bring musicians along with them, and Tiger's family also would be there to perform. So he says that amidst the swaying and the soughing of the trees all around, we used to listen to some wonderful music. So once again, as late as the early 20th century, you had a great environment in which music was being performed in the open. Today, if you go to this place, there are hardly any trees. And secondly, the only music you can hear is a house which says keyboard music lessons taught over here. That's it. Nobody knows anything about Tiger Vardacharya or Veena Krishnamacharya or K.V. Srinivasa Iyengar or about that wonderful Devadasi whom he describes called Kaipidi Kumrukku. Kaipidi Kirde is actually doing Abhinaya, that's all. So he says we had a Dasi in this temple called Kaipidi Kumrukku. And all the Arya Vaishya Chettis have sold their properties. They've all become streets. They've become houses. Just a warren of, residences, nothing more than that. And that musicality is completely lost from this environment. The Dubashas also appear to have, sorry, I should have mentioned, I did mention the Dubashas. So many of the Dubashas had townhouses, and they all had townhouses around Georgetown. So this is a photograph of Manali House, which is no longer in existence, now demolished. This is where the powerful Manali family lived, and just 2 streets away was the equally powerful Kovur family. And respectively, they hosted Muthuswami Dikshitar and Tyagaraja. And in both these houses, performances must have happened. Perhaps it was in this house that the violin was actually fine-tuned to become a part of Carnatic music tradition. This building is not there today. It's become a car parking facility and all that. But there is no denying that the city residences of the Dubashas must have also played a role in fostering music. But once again, if now this house doesn't exist, but Bandar Street Kovur house still stands. When you go there and you look at it, you find that there is no great performance space. So if at all performances must have happened, it must have been to an audience of 40 people or 30 people in a very intimate setting where people could have heard all the music that was being performed. And what is so interesting is one of the greatest musicians in Manali in Kovur Sundaresa Mudali's retinue was Veena Kuppayar, who was a disciple of Tyagaraja. He must have performed the Veena very often. And the Veena, even today, I hold, is a chamber music instrument. It does not lend itself to artificial amplifications, contact mics, and things like that. All of that destroys the real musical essence of the Veena. And it must have been in very intimate settings that the music must have been um, heard and listened to by many people. The first public venue, an auditorium of any kind for music in Madras, is this building, which is the Pachayappa's Hall, built in the 1850s. And by the 1880s, it becomes home to a Sabha called the Madras Jubilee Gayan Samaj, which probably is the first Sabha for classical music. Once again, to an invited audience comprising Britishers, administrators, and Indian members of society, where a speech would be given by someone on what was being performed so that everybody could understand, and then musicians would sing or play an instrument. If you go there today, very high ceiling, windows that in that era must have been completely kept open at all points of time during the performance, and just an empty rectangular hall. That's all that there is to this. The floor is made of wood. It's of the finest Burma teak. And when you stand at the other end, and when you say something, it is very clear that the person even standing on the veranda can hear what you're saying, provided there are no buses and cars honking and going around on the main road. In the 1870s, that must have definitely been the environment over here. And it must have been very easy to have had, you can imagine music performances, speeches being given. In fact, this was the meeting place for much of what went on in Madras city before the arrival of, the Victoria Public Hall. But it is very interesting that, we see that this venue, which was meant for a school, becomes a venue for music performances, because it kind of sets the trend. Thereafter, for a long period of time, music is performed in school classrooms. And so you look at this very poor photograph. This is a photograph of the Tondai Mandalam Tuluva Vellalar School in Georgetown. This is where after the Madras Jubilee Samaj, Gayan Samaj, you had what was called the Bhakti Marga Prasanga Sabha. And that Sabha had its performances over here. Now, this is a fairly large classroom. This can seat at least 100 people seated on the floor, 100 to 150 people. And you realize as to why this venue must have been selected, because that Bhakti Marga Prasanga Sabha never featured music performances or dance. It only performed Harikatha. And in the closing years of the 19th century and in the early years of the 20th century, Harikatha was the most popular art. At that time, Harikatha performers were receiving around 150 rupees for a performance, while Carnatic musicians were receiving around 50 rupees. Even the top ranking Carnatic artist would get around 50 rupees, not more than that. So that was the disparity in the earning levels between a performer of music and a performer of Harikatha, because the Harikatha had everything in it. It had story, it had humor, it had music, it had a little bit of dance, it had lots of stuff, much of entertainment. And so there was a larger kind of a public that came to listen to these stories as compared to the kind of groups that came to listen to music performances. And so this was the venue where those performances happened. Once again, you can see wooden rafters, not a very high ceiling, but windows all around that were kept open and must have provided for a lot of ventilation. The Hindu high school, which is in Triplicane, yet another venue, classrooms right around. And the classroom on the top floor was where the Parthasarthi Swami Sabha had its performances for a long time. You also had private residences where music was listened to, and this building, Dhanammal's house in Ramakrishna Chetty Street, once again, an upper floor where she performed the Veena. Only 20 to 25 people can sit, not beyond that. And even then, even in that era when ambient noises were not all that great, Dhanammal's assistants would ensure that no vendors came onto the streets, and people who came to listen could not make any kind of noise. If they did, she would put down her veena, and that would be the end of the performances. So they couldn't clap, they couldn't put talam, they couldn't sneeze. If they sneezed, that was it. The concert would end at that point of time very abruptly. So it was under such demanding conditions that these performances were held. So absolute silence was what was really needed. This is yet another venue. Today it's a go down for condiments. This is called the Thiruvannamalai Matam Hall in Natupillayar Kovil Street in Georgetown. A quadrangle inside, which is open to the sky, which must have been open to the sky. Today it's enclosed in order to ensure that the bags inside it don't get wet during rain. This again cannot seat more than 40 or 50 people. The great venue that was constructed was the Victoria Public Hall in the 1880s. And this could seat 1,500 people at any given point of time. Strangely enough, in its entire history between 1887 and 2020, not one Carnatic music performance has ever happened in this venue. Hindustani performances have happened, and several public meetings have occurred here, as also several theatrical presentations. And the Suguna Vilasa Sabha occupied the premises for a good 35 years. And from Pamal Samanda Mudaliar's diaries and from his memoirs, we get to realize that the acoustics of the Victoria Public Hall were abysmal. And he says that you had to have the vocal cords of a buffalo if you needed to be heard by the audience. These are his exact words. And he says that we all learned to bellow our dialogues so that people could hear. They also experimented with a number of things in order to improve the acoustics of the place. So they had a wire netted roof placed midway between the actual height of the ceiling and the height at which the speakers were standing and speaking, in the hope that that would absorb some of the noise and would ensure better sound travel to the people who were seated in front, that much of it was not lost to the roof above. And then they also had a canvas roof for some time. This is what he writes. But he says nothing ever contributed to an improvement in the acoustics of the Victoria Public Hall. And he says that this was essentially meant as an oratory. And this is where they were forced to perform, because the Suguna Vilasa Sabha was a hugely successful theatrical society, and they had sellout performances for almost 40 years of their existence. Ironically, when they collected enough money and built their own venue, they never staged a performance thereafter. They became so prosperous that they forgot what they had been initially founded for. But the years that they were in this lousy hall or in this venue with poor acoustics, that was their heyday, when audiences came and listened to them. It's a wonder as to how the Hindustani performances happened over here, because they happened in the pre-artificial amplification era. The loudspeakers and the mics had not come when people like Calcutta Goharjan and all came here and performed. So we have no idea as to how they managed it and what was the reaction of the audience, how they struggled to listen to the performer. The museum theatre, for the same reason, appears to have been completely shunned by classical musicians. And even when the All India Congress session happened in 1927 with a music conference in parallel, it was only the lectures that happened in the museum theatre. The concerts actually happened in an open pandal in the spur tank area. So it would appear that musicians and audiences preferred an open setting for performances, and it was only speeches that were meant to be held in a closed door venue like the museum theatre. Now, by this time, it was all very well to have managed with small venues where 30 people could sit, 40 people could sit. But there was an external phenomenon, or a technological innovation, so to speak, which was now bringing a lot more people to listen to Carnatic music performances. Between 1905 and 1925 or so, Harikatha gradually began to drop in terms of its popularity, though the decline had just begun. It wasn't perceptible at that time. The actual collapse of Harikatha would happen only in the 1950s. But even then, Carnatic music had begun to get more popular because of the gramophone industry. Beginning with 1905, Sound engineers from the gramophone and typewriter company were coming regularly to India. They were conducting what were known as recording tours. They would go and meet various artists and then they would get them to perform. All these recordings happened initially in Bangalore because they believed that the climate in Bangalore was far more suited for recording than what it was in Madras. And when it happened in Madras, it happened in the hotel in which the sound engineer would be staying. So a room would be converted into a makeshift studio with minimum, with canvas netting on all sides to ensure that external noises didn't come in, and then the musician would be invited to come in and perform. By the 1930s, you had recording studios like this one. This is demolished. This used to be at the end of Mount Road, and in near where the film chamber exists today. And this building was where HMV conducted most of its recordings later, including M.S. Subbalakshmi's famous Vishnu Sahasranamam, the Venkateshwara Suprabhatam, all that happened here. Not far from here was Saraswati Stores, which is where AVM had its recording orchestra. And a short distance away from there, you had P.R. and Sons, who had their recording orchestra. They were also into gramophone records. So between 1905 and 1925, 1930, the voices of our South Indian artists were being heard everywhere. And that resulted in a huge popularity for their performances because audiences wanted to come and listen live to the songs that had become famous over the gramophone. And that resulted in requirements for venues of 400, 500 people, and so on and so forth. And the old classrooms and schoolrooms couldn't really manage all that. Yet the small venues continued for a long time. So you had the Soundarya Mahal in Govindapanayakan Street, which existed almost till the 1950s as a music venue, as a place where theatre was performed, public events were held, as a Kalyana Mandapam. The Kalyana Mandapam is really the bane of the Carnatic music world. And even today, for some strange reason, there appears to be a feeling that any Kalyana Mandapam will do as a Carnatic music venue also. This probably, that curse must have started from Soundarya Mahal and it must have carried onwards and it has continued till this date. But more on that towards the end of the presentation. The first, after the Victoria Public Hall, which as I said was not really meant for music performances, the first venue where around 1,000 people could sit and listen to performances was the Gokhale Hall on Armenian Street. The ground floor could seat 750 people. The first floor could seat 750 people. The first floor audiences would not have a clear view of the stage because they would be seated on a long, same level veranda, flat veranda. And so the men behind or the women behind would have no idea of who was performing on stage. They would only be able to listen to the music. There is a dome on top of the Gokhale Hall, and that added to all the woes of a general performing musician. And so the acoustics initially were not all that great. Yet we have hugely exaggerated accounts of people like Chembai Vaidyanatha Bhagavatar performing here in 1914. And I can tell you that this is what research teaches you. When I wrote my book, Carnatic Summer, I believed that full account and I reproduced it in full in my book. It was only 10 years later that I realized that all that was written was clearly a falsehood because it says that that so much of crowd came that there was pressure to open the doors of this venue, and then the doors were opened and people sat on the road and listened. Without mics, without speakers, I have no idea what the man on the street, on Armenian Street, would have heard of what was going on inside Gokhale Hall, even though surrounding noises would have been very low in 1914, 1915. But by the 1930s, with artificial amplification having come in, Gokhale Hall was the venue for the performing arts for a very long time. If Gokhale Hall was the venue for big performances, small sabhas needed a venue even then. And they all took to the Young Men's Christian Association, which had several meeting rooms. And at one point of time in the 1920s, as many as 15 sabhas were operating simultaneously with the Young Men's Christian Association as their address. These were all fly-by-nights. They must have existed for 1 year, 6 months, 2 years at most, and things like that. But they all used this as their venue. And of course, they must not have had their performances on the same day. But this was the place where a lot of Carnatic music was heard in a small room called the Mukkunahi Hall, which again can seat just around 40 people with reasonable acoustics in it. You can see this cartoon, which was printed in 1931, just before the arrival of artificial amplification. So it's a very basic venue. As you can see, there is a naked bulb which is providing the illumination on top. And you've got, Tanjabur Vaidyanatha Iyer on the Mridangam, Musri Subramania Iyer performing, and Semangudi Narayan Swami Iyer on the violin. And you can see that he's actually showing his back is actually part of the same cartoon. When I scanned it, my technical skills were not good enough to get it as one picture, which is why it's appearing as two. He would turn his face to the audience and show his back to the main artist whenever he had to play the violin, because that's the only way that the audiences would be able to hear what he was playing on his violin. And in fact, it was the violinist who was majorly challenged as far as the acoustics were concerned. People like Mahal, the male, particularly the male musician in the era when there were no mics, they all had much higher pitches than what they had today. And there were clearly two categories of musicians. One that had male musicians who had a very high pitch, so they drew a much larger audience. Then you had the male who had a very deep voice, who remained essentially a chamber artist. So you had people like Mahavaidyanatha Sivan, who had a very high voice, and so he attracted huge audiences. And you had his bitter rival Patnam Subramania Iyer, who had a very deep voice, who remained essentially a chamber but a very respected artist at the same time. So the violinist, you can see over here, would turn his back to the main artist and perform. Violinists would evolve their own strange amplification methods before the arrival of the mic. So you had Marangapuri Gopalakrishna Iyer, who had a horn attached to his violin, and that was known as the phono violin. So he would play the violin, and that horn would amplify the noise that would then carry. It was actually an American creation, this phono violin. Even now you can read about it. It's called it's got a name beginning with Z. I forget what it is. And it came to see Saraswati Bai, the Harikatha performer, who gifted it to Marangapuri Gopalakrishna Iyer, and he became an expert on the phono violin. And then Chaudaya hit upon the idea of adding strings to his violin. So from 4 strings, he made a 7-stringed violin. Then he had a 19-stringed violin. He had a brute of a 21-stringed violin as well, which only he could play. Nobody else could make any music out of it. So he was known as Soundaya because the kind of noise that he made with the violin, no vocalist could stand a chance performing along with him. He was greatly feared for the multi-stringed violin, the 7-stringed and the higher stringed violins that he would bring. So violinists had a great struggle. Males had a great struggle because of their natural pitch. Once their voices broke, their voices would come down. So Musri, who you see over here, had a very high pitch for a male. His voice was almost feminine in terms of, you can even now when you hear his recordings, you can see that Musri's voice is very, very high pitched for a male artist. At around this time, this is the 1920s, which is when you first see sabhas being built exclusively for music performances. So up to now, we have seen school buildings, we've seen auditories, we've seen public venues, we've seen temples. The primary function was not for music performances. The primary function was something else. And music found that a suitable venue and came in and hired the venue and began to perform there. But in the 1920s, you suddenly find a shift and you find that auditoriums are beginning to be built for music performances. The first of these in the city is the Rashikaranjani Sabha, built in 1928. There's a very bad photograph of the old auditorium that stood. It was a jewel of an auditorium. That's all I can say. And the design for these auditoriums were all copied from the cinema theaters that had been built just around 5 to 10 years earlier. Or just around at that time, the cinema theaters were continuing to be built. So I have put over here a photograph of the Philatelic Bureau building on Mount Road, which was the electric theater built in 1913. And you can see over here that it's got a sloping roof. It's got a set of entrances and exits all around, which could be kept open. And at the end, you have a wall where the film would have been screened. Audiences coming in from the left of this picture inside, and the wall was somewhere here. Essentially, a number of cinema theaters would copy this design of the electric theater. You remember, I don't know how many of you remember the Crown Theater, which used to be at the end of Mint Street. It was almost identical to this. Murugan Talkies, which was known as Kinema Central on St. Xavier's Street, which also was known as the Prince of Wales Theatre for some time, that had a very similar structure. Even today, the Star Talkies in triplicane stands, though it is not functional, it is an almost identical design to what the electric theatre is. And the Rashikaranjani Sabha would follow that design almost to a T. So you had a long, flat chamber where people would come and sit. There was a stage at one end, a sloping roof made of non-permanent material, essentially later on asbestos and things like that, but a tiled roof, windows and doors on all sides, people coming in, natural ventilation, and you're being able to listen to the performance. I have heard performances in the old RR Sabha venue before it was demolished in the 1990s. And it was a pleasure to just sit there because that road, Sundareshwara Swami Street, hardly got any traffic. And even in the 1990s, it was a very quiet place. It was only when it rained that you heard all the thunder and the water pouring down. Even then, it was nice to listen to a performance over there because somehow it gave you a great sense of peace to be in that venue with the surrounding area completely open, and you are being one with the elements when you are listening to a performance over there. Of course, it's not available anymore. And you will see that after 1928, till the 1950s, till the arrival of the Tamil Isai Sangam and the Music Academy, the Rasikaranjani Sabha design would be followed by as many as 3 sabhas that followed. So the Vani Mahal, which was the Tyaga Brahma Gana Sabha, which came in the 1940s in T Nagar, the Mylapore Fine Arts Society, as well as the third one, which I have, of which the Krishna Gana Sabha, which also came up in the 1950s. All of them copied this basic design of the RR Sabha. And the Mylapore Fine Arts Club, even today, exists with the same design, while all the others have conducted significant modifications to their earlier shell. The Ripon building had a, now this is the time when I spoke to you about the gramophone. I'd also now like to add about the broadcasting service. So from 1924, you had broadcasting beginning, and you needed a broadcasting facility, a place where you could record and broadcast. So the top room of the Ripon building was the studio of the Corporation Radio, which is where the artists came and performed. When you go there, and I was privileged to do that in 2013, I was able to see the old recording studio room, which is just below the clock tower. And you find that it's just a room, nothing other than that. So they had a recording apparatus at one end of it, and the artists would sit there and perform. So the general, when you read the corporation report, you realize that this road had hardly any traffic and there was no noise. So artists would come early in the morning or late in the evening, and they would record over there, and then they would leave. And that was sufficient for a good broadcasting service. Later, the All India Radio would come out of this, and you can see the All India Radio mic here between Brinda and Mukta. They would actually fine-tune recording to a very great extent, the All India Radio. Even today, the All India Radio's positioning of the Mridangam artist, the violin, the other Pakavadyams, and the main artist is unparalleled. The concert recordings that we have even today from the 1950s, 60s, when, you know, so-called technology was still in its earlier stages, unbeatable for the kind of music that they provided. So they kind of fine-tuned recording in a way that no Sabha was able to do for a very long time, and perhaps hasn't done it even today. The Music Academy, of course, was born at around this time, but I'm going to fast forward this to just tell you that the history of the Music Academy is also the same history that we have followed up to now. Begins in a pandal in the spur tank. And then after flirting with a closed door environment like the University Senate House and Mani Iyer's Hall, goes back to an open pandal for the next 6 years. Between 1930 and 1935, a pandal behind Ripon building in My Lady's Garden, which they believed was the best venue. And then even later in 1936, 1937, even in a place like General Patters Road, at a special pandal, General Patters Road opposite Congress House, And down below, you now find the greatest threat to Carnatic music has finally made its appearance with loudspeaker arrangements. Till now, nobody has spoken about loudspeakers, but from the 1930s onwards, even the great Veena Dhanam, who demanded absolute silence, descended to the level where she came and performed with an advertisement that said special loudspeaker arrangements will be made available to listen to Veena Dhanam's Veena. So even she had to succumb to artificial amplification. And after that, we have fought an increasingly losing battle with amplification. Today, the artist's idea of amplification is one thing, the sound man's idea of amplification is another thing, the audience's idea of amplification is a third entity altogether. And it is a continuing battle between these three, that when the artist has come and has sat down for a performance, for the first 25 minutes, you will find every artist on stage signaling to the sound man to increase their respective instruments' mic levels. Now, the sound man is just not bothered. He knows that it is yet another performance through which he has to sit. So he will not do any adjustment whatsoever unless it is a great star who is performing on stage and there are 1,500 fans in the audience who may come and beat him up at the end of it. Then he will become all attention and then he will keep fiddling with the controls, and the fiddling of the controls will continue till the end of the performance. And then the other thing is the artist will keep saying, I am not getting feedback. The audience has no idea that the artist needs feedback. So they'll say, எங்களுக்கு நன்னா கேட்கறது. So the idea is not that you should hear. The idea is that the artist should also know what is happening, what kind of, the audience will never ever understand this. So it's one continuous battle for increasing the sound level on an ongoing basis. So some of the sabhas which perform from makeshift venues, and I'm not going to name them over here, they have solved the problem by setting the volume to the maximum, getting in the biggest speakers possible, and positioning them at the most inconvenient places where if you are fated to sit close to the speaker, you would have lost a significant amount of hearing by the end of the performance. But at the end of it, people still come away saying, Romba nanna irundhathu kacheri. I sometimes wonder, have they lost their sense of balance in listening to a good performance in a controlled environment? How can they say that this performance was great when the loudspeaker arrangements or the amplification arrangements were so bad? This is a photograph from the 1950s in the PS High School grounds of the Music Academy's annual conference, Madhuramani Iyer's year, and you can see the thronging audience that is seated to listen to a concert. During this time, performances continued in very domestic places. So you had Jagannatha Bhakta Sabha run by these two terrors, Muttanna on one side, Rangaramanuja Iyengar on the other. They both had no saliva, they had only acid. But they organized some of the best performances in the veranda of Muttanna's house, which was called Veda Vilas, and it survived till the 1950s. No fans. You had only hand fans with which you had to fan yourself. You had to be seated on the ground to listen to the music that was going on. But making a name in Jagannatha Bhakta Sabha was very important. But on Egmore High Road, there was no traffic even in the 1950s. You could listen to a performance seated in a veranda. Again, only 30 or 40 people, but it was very important to make a name for yourself over here. Shastri Hall, which comes up in the 1950s, today air-conditioned essentially to keep the traffic out. Without the traffic, with the windows open till the 1990s, this was a place to be in. What wonderful acoustics. With Nageshwara Park just behind you, complete silence in Lusk Corner, and you could listen to some great music over here. These were the three sabhas that I mentioned to you earlier, all of which copied the Rashikaranjani Sabha design. And you can see the Mylapore Fine Arts Club, though it's changed a little, it's essentially remained the way it is even today. The Tamil Isai Sangam is the one that makes the first break with this traditional designs. Even though at its core, it's a rectangular arrangement, which can with no balcony. At one level, it's a rectangular arrangement with a stage. This was a large venue for music with artificial amplification brought in, constructed in 1952 with L.M. Chitale as the architect, and constructed at a cost of 8 lakhs. The the land was given on a 50-year lease by the Corporation of Madras. Even today, it exists on a lease, which has been renewed repeatedly. Now, the Music Academy at that time detested the Tamil Isai Sangam. And so when the Tamil Isai Sangam was constructed, some of the discussions that went on in the Music Academy and fueled by the Music Academy, some of the editorials that appeared in the Hindu at that time are very interesting to read. So the Hindu talks about, just in 1945, it's no coincidence that this happens, that this article comes in 1945, because that's when the foundation stone for the Tamil Isai Sangam's auditorium has just been laid. The plans have been made public. And the Hindu says that a vast music hall with a surging undertone of casual conversation, punctuations of applause, and the clamorous distortion of the microphone provides the worst possible setting for Carnatic music, which is more of a chamber art. So Music Academy delighted with this kind of a comment coming from the Hindu. And immediately in the academy, the discussion is, oh, when we build our auditorium, it will be in a natural setting, no mics, no artificial amplification. We will have doors and windows open. So they buy this property called Sweet Home. And you can see what Sweet Home was inside before it was demolished. Just look at this. Louvered doors. So you can actually open those louvers and, those slats. And you can ensure that you get air coming in. And it had a vast garden surrounding it on Radhakrishnan Sale. This is the main performance space of the old house, the upper floor, the main performance space. And this is where chamber concerts and music teaching would happen. So it had no fans apparently till the building was brought down. And it was only the sea breeze from Marina that actually provided the cooling for this place. And this is where the academy never conducted its season over here, but this is where its concerts would be held on a regular basis throughout the year. And the upper floor on which you see these people seated, originally it was a wooden floor which had to be later replaced apparently, and you see them seated on a replaced concrete floor. But originally it was a wooden floor that I think the wood had worn out or whatever it was, and it had to be replaced. But this is how the old building was, and then they decided to bring it down. This is the plan that comes from the architects G.M. Bhuta and Sons, based out of Bombay. And these were, as the eminent architect P.T. Krishnan said last week when he was recorded on the Music Academy, he said Bhuta was very influenced by Le Corbusier, and so it makes complete use of the style of Le Corbusier in building the auditorium. And once again, I'm quoting P.T. Krishnan when he says that the bell-shaped design of the Music Academy made for a very good design as far as music performances were concerned. Now, what is very interesting is that when the Music Academy was being built, and this is an institution of which we have very interesting records of how it was designed. And so the engineer writes, this is what he writes. As the hall is designed specifically for the playing and the hearing of music, the audience has been brought into as close a proximity with the performer as possible. This resulted in the plan being of a wide fan shape. The rear aisle of the balcony, less than 80 feet from the stage, is about 144 feet wide. The auditorium will seat around 1,800 persons, 700 in the ground floor, and the rest in the balcony. The proscenium opening of the stage is 60 feet into 20 feet, wide enough to enable the audience in the remotest corner of the balcony to have an undistracted view of the performance at a comfortable angle. In front of the stage, provision for an orchestra pit has been made with a facility for closing it when not required. That was never closed. It finally became the press pit. And it is known among the press persons as Kashmir because that is where the air conditioning would be at its most powerful. And generally, if you sat there, you were frozen to death. Of course, the architect and the engineer Tambaya says over here that it will seat 1,800 people. Eventually, it would seat 1,500, and today it seats 1,350. But the top aisle from which you get an undistracted view of the stage, you have to be really agile and physically fit in order to climb up to that top. And you should not have any fear of heights when you look down at the stage from there. So some elderly people I know have named it Kishkinda, because you have to be of that species if you have to enjoy music performances. So the academy spans Kashmir to Kishkinda at two different levels. But the story of the amplification, it'll be a fully equipped stage with a revolving platform for drama recitals. That never happened. The revolving platform would not become a reality. But finally, when the hall was ready for inauguration, that is when they discover that all this story about natural amplification is going to be a complete failure, because there is a dreadful echo in the music academy. And finally, sacking is placed on all the walls to absorb the echo in 1962. Then the engineers from the National Physical Laboratory, Delhi, are brought in, and they do a complete study. And finally, the Hindu, which wrote about the Tamil Isai Sangam, has to eat crow. And in 1964, the Hindu has to write high quality stereophonic sound system designed as to make the microphones and the loudspeakers inconspicuous in appearance and imperceptible in sound, both to the performers and to the audience. So finally, that marks the Music Academy as it was constructed. After that, the next big construction, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, is the Narada Gana Sabha, which goes back to the box arrangement of the Tamil Isai Sangam. It's a similar design to what we have over there. We have had some very nice small settings over the years. So one of my favorites is the Ragasudha Hall, built by Krishnan, who is no more today. But he was a man with a passion for sound. And so he created this beautiful little space, which he designed himself. And he was into civil construction. He was a contractor. He knew building. And therefore, he designed it. And it even today remains a very affordable venue for smaller music performances. The fact is, you can design a building, you can say that it is best at the time of building, but over a period of time, the best of designs fall behind times. And that is what was discovered in the Music Academy as well in the last 10 years or so, when sound engineers were called in, because we had a resident ghost in the Music Academy. Every time the Mridangam artist would play the Tanyavartanam on stage, there would be a ghost at the back end which would continue repeating whatever he said. And audiences caught in the middle would actually be hearing two Mridangams, one in front of them, one at the back. And this was the beginning of a problem. And to solve that, we called in experts. And finally, they said that the Academy auditorium is now full of dead spots because of various renovations and restorations and all kinds of things that have gone on over a period of time. Last year, the entire paneling and the cladding of the walls was stripped down, and completely new acoustic design was created to ensure that the Academy went back to being true to being a great musical venue. And so today, it does have great acoustics. That ghost has finally been buried. It doesn't make its appearance any longer, but it had a run of the place for as long as 15 years or so. And fans have gone, and the side walls have all been specially contoured. Every inch of the side walls have now been contoured to make for better acoustics. So continuous investment in a venue is very, very important, which is quite forgotten. And let's not forget it, many sabhas don't have the means for doing it also. It's not a hugely profit-making activity that they can spend a lot of money in improving their venues. You have some wonderful small chamber venues like the Artery, which is in Balaji Nagar, singer Saumya's residence, which is now run as a facility for chamber music performances. Sitting here and listening to music is just wonderful. Then you've got the MS Subbalakshmi Auditorium, built in the Asian College of Journalism premises without any artificial amplification. It's designed in such a way that even a small feather falling on the stage can be heard right up to the end. And we witnessed two performances as part of the inauguration. And this was where we realized that apart from the audiences, artists also have become slave to artificial amplification. So I'm not going to mention names, but we had one artist who was clearly an expert in the way that artists performed. I'm not mentioning genders also over here, so you won't be able to find out who it was. And the performance was a great success. Another performance had the artists completely wondering where they were, because they were continuously searching for that sound man, for the mic, and they were very clearly uncomfortable about performing in this venue. Audiences were not very comfortable either. They kept wondering whether they were able to hear, when they were able to hear perfectly well. So it's more a question of corrupting of the listening faculty of the audiences, and the ability of the artist to throw his or her voice to ensure that the audiences are able to hear. So we have one of the best facilities, probably the only one of its kind in South India, or perhaps in the whole of India. I think Tara will be able to correct me on that, where you don't have any artificial amplification at all, and you can listen to some of the best performances. Strangely enough, the college doesn't let it out, and we have no performances over here. After those two inaugural concerts, I don't know whether we've had anything. So this is where I'm going to leave you. So we have had a long history from the time when we started with concerts in the open, and then making do with what we got as an enclosed area, which was school buildings, auditoriums, any location that would suit a music performance. Sometimes they think that just an empty hall with a stage at the end would do. Even now, that feeling persists. And then we've had a few specialized venues where we have some great custom built acoustics, where music can be heard at its best. But it's never the end of a journey, and all such institutions will have to keep investing in themselves if they want to remain relevant with the strides that technology is taking. So let's hope for the best, and let's wait and see what happens in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, sir. We have a few questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So somebody asks, how about the playground of PS High School?
Once again, it was that thatched enclosure that I showed you, that photograph of a Madhuramani Iyer performance. That was taken in the PS High School playground only. So it is an open venue with a pandal. That's about it. Nothing beyond that. So I couldn't take you through all the locations of the Music Academy, because that is quite a history by itself. Starting from 1928, coming up to 1962, when they move into this present location. PS High School ground is one of the many venues.
A question from Mr. Pavitran. Do we have any records of yesteryear musicians' preference for venue or acoustics?
I have generally noticed that they never ever spoke about their preference for a location or acoustics. In fact, the only record, very interestingly, is of M.S. Subbalakshmi, who rarely ever spoke about such things. The T.T. Krishnamachari writes a beautiful account of, in the 1940s, after independence, Subbalakshmi visits Delhi, and TTK takes her to Parliament House on an off day and shows her the Lok Sabha chamber, the Rajya Sabha, the Central Hall. And I believe she told him, Mama, inge or kacheri padina evlo nanna irukum. So I think, that is the only comment I have ever heard or read where a musician expresses a certain preference or a certain delight in a well-constructed venue where, they would like to perform. Otherwise, they rarely ever spoke about it.
Mr. Ashwin Bhandarkar asks, when was the first ticketed concert of Carnatic music held? Who were the artists?
I think, and Mahavaidyanatha Sivan, but he refused to allow the concert to be ticketed. And he then performed for free in the Parthasarathi Swami temple. But after that, tickets have been sold. So from the 1890s, we have had, certainly remember, theatre was ticketed even before this. And Hindustani performances in Madras were also ticketed from the early 1900s. So even prior to a formal sale of tickets, we did have a system of collection. So a plate would be circulated among the audience, and people would place whatever they could afford, and that money would be given to the artist. Even today, many people come without any money to concert performances. They'll get down from their swanky cars and come in and say, Patruba Potrakan ticket again, and they'll get back into their cars and go home. So there is a feeling even now that Carnatic music concert should be given free, and the audience, the artist must live on pure air and nothing else. So that I think goes back to those days when people, you know, expected someone else to bear the burden of hosting the Carnatic artist.
This is a question from V.V. Ramanan.
Hmm.
Were the music conferences always held at the end of the year, or have they been held in the summer months as well?
1930 was the only time when the conference was held in summer. March, April, it was held for 3 days, which is why today, when you look at the Music Academy's history, this is the 94th annual concert series. Academy itself is only 93 years old. That's because 1 year in 1930, there were two conferences, one in March and the other in December. And after that, they decided that December would be the season. Thereafter, all other sabhas followed suit. And so it has never changed. There is a question from Arun Kumar. During Nayak Maratha period, whether women were permitted to sit? Never. Even as late as the 1940s or 50s, as long as the Pandal system existed in the Music Academy, a rope would be drawn separating the men from the women. And for a long period of time, women were not allowed to sit along with men to listen to performances. No, it didn't happen.
The next question is, what about the Kalakshetra venues? How do you rate them?
I would rate it very, very highly. I would say that it's one of the best venues, except for the mosquito, which comes along with the same number as the audience and troubles you to no end. But it is a great venue, in my opinion. Outstanding venue.
Mr. Ramagopalan says, few words on Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and why it does not ticket few performances.
Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, as per its mandate, cannot ticket any performance. It is written in the charter of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan that it is meant for performances to be provided free for the spread of Indian culture. So they never ever sell tickets for any of the. They may release their hall out to some other agency, but even then, I think even those cannot have tickets sold for a performance in Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. I think Mr. Ramswamy may be able to correct me on that, but this is the. It is not supposed to sell tickets.
Sir, we're just going to take one question from the YouTube listeners.
Yeah.
Mr. Venkateshwar Rao asks, do you think the Egmore Museum Theatre meets the demands of acoustics for a music performance?
I am not an expert at it. I don't know. But all I can say is that I have attended 2 or 3 theatrical performances with a lot of music in them in the Egmore Museum Theatre, and I found them to be quite good. So I think today, with the technology that we have, I think even the museum theatre would be a good venue for music performances.
The next question is from Ananta Krishnan. How has the evolution of the scene and setting of a music presentation affected the music presented?
I don't know if the setting has affected the music in any way, but audience tastes have definitely affected the music. The shortening of the concert duration, the reduction in the time spent on the Ragam Tanam Pallavi, the increase in the variety of songs that need to be presented. This is a century-old phenomenon, and it continues to evolve. For instance, even in our lifetime, we have witnessed the complete death of the Padam. Nobody sings a Padam anymore, whereas still 30 years ago, it was a very you did have people singing padams in the second half of the concert. Today, we talk about the padam, but how many? I have probably heard 2 padams in my whole life of 54 years up to now. And that is from a recording of Brinda and Mukta. I have never heard padams being performed live. So when we read about it, we realize that in the last 50 years, genres have vanished. And perhaps more will go this way. And now the wretched COVID has given rise to, you must remember that every person who listens to Carnatic music has two professions. One is his or her own profession, and the other one is the management of Carnatic music and giving ideas on what it should be doing. So there is this latest trend to speculate that, the new world has come and people will have the patience only to listen to a half an hour performance. And in a 2.5 hour performance, you should now have 5 artists presenting. I shudder to think of such things. I mean, that is not Carnatic music. That is just singing. That's it. Whereas a classical art requires time for presenting its various features if you want to get a holistic idea of what that art is all about. So audience tastes ultimately is what really dictates everything. So perhaps over a period of time, we may witness all kinds of things. We have no idea.
Next question is from Mr. Ashwin. Isn't Madras innovating with regard to venues
there is
like
no
holding
doubt.
concerts in theatres, etc.?
But at the end of the day, while I really commend what Mahesh is doing in terms of his innovations in terms of venues, it is what amplification is. It is audiences brought in to listen in a certain setting, which is very similar to what it is in an auditorium. And over a period of time, he has done some in the open, but he has faced huge challenges in featuring concerts in the open because of the ambient noise and the lack of such places in a city like this. So he has gone back to holding it in various places like theaters and all that. It is an experimentation in venue, and we must see what happens in a long period, but it is a very commendable initiative in my opinion.
Mr. Vaidyanathan asks, is there a venue similar to Indian Museum in Kolkata in Chennai?
I am not. The museum theatre, as an adjunct to the government museum in Egmore, is what was meant as an equivalent to the performing space in the Indian Museum in Calcutta. So perhaps so that is what it was supposed to be, but it hasn't really fulfilled that purpose.
So this question is from Shivapriya Krishnan viewing on YouTube. What's your view on the Madras University Senate Auditorium?
Beautiful as a building. It's a real treat, an absolute horror as a music venue. And I am not the only person to say this. Professor Sambamurthy has also said this. So I bow to what he has said, and I have also had occasion to witness a couple of events in the Senate House. It is absolutely useless as far as a music venue is concerned. And even in the 1940s, when the academy operated from there for 3 years, the president, K.V. Krishnaswamy Iyer, was hard put to ensure that there was proper acoustics for people to be able to listen to music. And again, this whole treatment of sackcloth being put on the windows and all that, and that is how it was improved upon, and they conducted it there. But it's not a great place.
Ms. Vidya Nagarajan asks, what is your view on this virtual music season this year? Do you think it's a good platform which would be embraced by our Sabhas in the years to come?
Yes, in the sense that it does make music available for a lot more people than compared to the numbers that would actually come to listen in an auditorium. It has its drawbacks in the sense that does the audience have the discipline of sitting and watching a performance for 2 to 2.5 hours without answering the doorbell, giving instructions to the cook, without husband walking bare-bodied behind when the concert is going on, or suddenly coming along saying "Thunde engarku, mug engarku," etc., etc. These are all. It requires a lot of audience discipline, and let's not forget that Carnatic. This is my view, and I'm willing to be beaten up for it. Carnatic music thrives on a reasonable amount of audience indiscipline. So even in a concert, artists themselves are very comfortable with people speaking on cell phones, walking up and down, opening the door at any given point of time, coming in, waving to people. I always believe that the Music Academy's VIP entrance is the point from which all indiscipline begins. You will come late to a performance, you will open the door and stand there for a minute looking at everybody so that everybody will turn in that direction to look at you walking in. Then having ensured that everybody has looked, you will then slowly walk down the place and then get into your seat, which somebody else has reserved for you 45 minutes earlier. And the Boy Scout is giving dirty looks continuously. So this indiscipline should not be carried to great heights when a virtual performance happens. And I also live in mortal fear of the time when the numbers of people watching it virtually will exceed the number that comes to the auditorium A. B, the demand of the virtual audience to shorten the duration of the concert. Today, as it is, the Carnatic music concert is on a very thin wicket at 2 hours and 2.5 hours. Now, the general feeling is that we shouldn't have more than 1 hour or 90 minutes. What will happen to the Tanyavartanam? What will happen to the Upapakavadyam? These are all questions that we need to ponder about. What will happen to the Pallavi? Will it vanish over a period of time because of the demand that the music should be shortened in duration? So this is something, so it's a blessing. It's also a curse in many ways. I'll be happiest when everybody gets back to the auditorium.
Mr. Shankaran asks, can you talk about Bhajana Mandapams too?
A very large and long topic. Without Bhajana Mandapams, there would not have been any Carnatic music. When I put this presentation together, I debated long and hard within myself as to what I should do, whether I should bring in the topic of Bhajana Mandapams or not. But the history and the evolution of Bhajana Mandapams in Madras it really requires somebody to do a PhD thesis one day. The number of I spoke about these semi-open venues. So Bhajana Mandapams were classic examples of that. They generally existed around temple areas. So you find a lot of them in Purshavakam, in Georgetown, in Triplicane. You have plenty, where even today audiences meet for bhajans. But they are not venues where today Carnatic music performances are held. Once again, I go back to Tiger's radio talk, where he talks about Bhajana Mandapams in Mint Street, where every Sunday artists would meet at 4 o'clock. And artists like him went essentially because singing to the accompaniment of the rhythm that is provided for a bhajan is a very, very tough task. And that trains the musician it grounds the musician in a very sound discipline as far as rhythm was concerned. I went and identified that Bhajana Mandapam also and shed tears when I saw its present condition. And I couldn't believe that this is where Tiger, Tachur brothers, R.G. and Ambi Pillai had all come every Sunday for several years and performed. It was very sad to go to that particular location.
What about Lady Andal Auditorium, asks Ishwar.
I thought of including it, then I realized no Carnatic music has ever happened over there. So I decided it's an excellent auditorium, there's no doubt. But I think it's in Egmore, which, we South Madras types don't recognize as a Carnatic music center. So.
Mr. Pavitran asks, how about concerts on the beach, pre and post independence?
Not heard of any.
On a lighter note, has any artist walked out complaining of acoustics affecting his or her performances?
Veena Dhanamar has done it in 1936 in the Music Academy. Somebody wore squeaking rubber slippers, apparently, and came in. And so she put down her veena and she was blind and demanded that people help her. And she walked out of the performance and said she wasn't coming back. So I like her. I mean, you need guts to be an artist of that kind. So she did it.
Did artist Shruti change on a wide and generalized way with the arrival of microphones?
The male voice particularly went down in pitch. And it became very comfortable for musicians to sing with the arrival of the microphone. An artist like Semangudi, for instance, who perhaps, in my opinion, was perhaps the greatest Carnatic music artist ever, he could not have survived in an era when there was no amplification. Though it did amplify the faults in his voice as well, there is no doubt about it. His blowing of his nose and then making all kinds of guttural noises, his taking in deep gusts of breath when he would sing, but all that added to the drama. But his voice was of such a low pitch that he couldn't have managed. He had essentially a weak voice, but what a sensation he became. That's more because of the amplification that happened.
Mr. Raghu asks, have we had artists refusing to sing in any venue?
The whole history of Carnatic music in Chennai is of artists refusing to sing in particular venues. So every year we have had somebody fighting with some location and not wanting to go there. You start with Mahavaidyanath Sivan and come right up to 2020 without names being mentioned. I can name at least three from the current generation. It's only a story of people falling foul, artists and organizers falling foul of each other and refusing to host or to perform in a particular venue. So lots.
Mr. Anirudh Swaminathan has two questions. The first one being, do we see any innovative ideas for venues being borrowed from other Indian cities like Bombay or Calcutta or abroad?
Uh, I would say that I don't know if we need to look at a different city, but there's a lot of innovation that's been going on. For instance, I think Tara is probably the best person who can talk about how this mic-free auditorium really came about in the Asian College of Journalism. In my opinion, that is perhaps the greatest innovation that has happened in our city in the last 50 or 60 years. Let's see, more than that, because mics came in 1932. And if after that we have been able to break free of the tyranny of that and produce an auditorium which can actually sustain a music performance without mics, I mean, that is perhaps one of the greatest innovations. We spoke about Mahesh and his Madrasana, which is a continuous quest for an innovative location where music can be performed, or later, I'm sure, dance as well. So I think innovation will continue to happen.
Question number two is, did requirements of dance or theatre play a role in the evolution of Carnatic music venues?
I would say that it was the other way around. It was when music moved into a particular place. See, dance became public, so to speak, much after music. So it was only from 1933 onwards that dance actually got onto a platform to an invited audience, and not to a religious or a patron's venue. So dance just followed music wherever it went. Theater has had a much longer and a much richer history, I must say. And theater, even today, it is only now in the last 40 years or something that we have had theaters, of 50 years maybe, theaters coming to venues where music is performed. Initially, theaters had their own locations. The two did not really meet. For instance, we read a lot about open air theaters in places like Georgetown, Mutyalpet, then where the High Court building stands today. Then in Royapuram, we read a lot about these locations where a lot of theater was performed. It's not there anymore. But theater has today come to conform to the same locations where music is also performed.
How did he get the moniker Tiger?
He
Asks.
himself, he doesn't offer any explanations himself. It's only construed from, or rather interpreted from what happened. Apparently, he was, what is it? He used to growl because he had a very bad voice. So his physical movements and his contortions were that of a almost like a tiger. So that is how he was given the name Tiger. And the Mysore Maharaja also called him Lion. So finally, he had a letterhead that was printed that said Tiger Lion Vardacharya. And that is how he was a personality. Tiger was something else altogether. Sadly, we have only one recording of his, but he was great.
Does Music Academy have a Tamil name?
It's a very Sanskritized Tamil name, Sangeeta Vidvat Sabai. So it's got 3 Sanskrit words in it, and it passes off as a Tamil name.
Mr. Pavitran asks, do you think Tamil Nadaswaram concerts had an edge over vocal concerts in the pre-mic era?
In fact, I'm sorry I missed that out. I'm very grateful that you asked that question, because without this, the presentation would have been incomplete. The two great casualties with the arrival of the mic were the Nagaswaram and the Veena. And they were at the two ends of the performing spectrum. The Nagaswaram was such a strident and bold instrument that it did not require amplification of any kind with the tawil, and it was meant exclusively for processions and for outdoor performances. And it was forced to get into the tyranny of the proscenium. And then finally, it demanded amplification as well, something that it really did not require. And it lost the fundamental character of how it was supposed to be. It was meant for night-long temple processions, and today, of course, there's a lot of debate on it. There is the caste angle, and with greater awareness, we have come to question a lot of things that we accepted in the past as far as the Nagaswaram is concerned. So what I give you as an answer is not complete, but the Nagaswaram today, I would say, is a very weak uh, self as compared to what it was at one time. And even today, in my opinion, it is subjected to a lot of insults because of ignorance. So, you invite a great Nagaswaram artist for a wedding performance, and he's beautifully performing a Natakuranji, and suddenly the priest grabs the mic and says, Nirtungo, Nirtungo, Geti Melam Padungo, Gauri Kalyanam Padungo. And then the priest launches into a speech while this man has been stopped in the middle of a raga. And then when there is a temple procession, today with the traffic and the cars and the vendors and everybody shouting and yelling, what Nagaswaram performance? But in the midst of all this, 5 years ago, I remember Kapalishwara temple procession, Adhikara Nandi coming out and this Nagaswaram artist performing. This woman who sells vegetables there goes up to him and says, Thambi, ni gaula vasi pella na vandu kekren. So, see, there is that awareness as well. So, something that me with my upper middle class background, see, this kind of thing, right? But look at the awareness that is there. So, Nagaswaram was meant for a different place, environment and a time and a place. And today it suffers. Similarly, the Veena is also subject to the same tyranny. It was a chamber music instrument without any amplification. It was meant for 40 people and 50 people. So today you have contact mics, you have these huge speakers that go along with it. And finally, what they belt out of the Veena, I don't think was meant to be ever produced on the Veena. Of course, it's a versatile instrument. There is no doubt about it. But these are the two instruments that have become the biggest casualties. The violin, I think, was the greatest gainer of them all.
Before we take one more question from the chat box, there is a question from a YouTube viewer. I used to hear Parveen Sultana in the 1970s in Chennai quite often. Is there a different kind of demand for Hindustani music at venues?
I don't know if there is a great demand for Hindustani music any longer in Chennai. I think, see, classical music itself is on a diminishing scale, let us say. I mean, audiences have only reduced over the years, though a very heartening factor is that youngsters today appear to be coming back in greater numbers to listen to classical music than what they were doing in the 1980s. But Hindustani music today, I would say, has a very, very restricted audience. And even if you feature a great star in the music academy, you find that hardly a few rows get filled when that performance happens. So I would say that the requirement is not the same, but yes, I think the number of people willing to appreciate Hindustani has come down even more. I'm told by Hindustani musicians that the number of people appreciating Hindustani music worldwide has also come down much more than what they see in the world of Carnatic music. In fact, some of them tell me that your world is thriving. Your people go all over the world. They give so many concerts. Then you've got this December festival. Right through the year, you have something. They say that there is nothing like this in Hindustani music. So there is probably, it is probably on a, at a greater level of decline than what Carnatic music is today.
Do all Sangeeta Kalanidhis get honorary life membership of the Academy?
Yes, Ramanan, they do. They do get honorary life membership of the Music Academy, minus voting rights.
And why Poochi for Srinivas Iyengar?
There again, three reasons. One is that he used to apply Chandanam on himself, so Pooch became Poochi. Then he was very mischievous as a child, so he was continuously moving around, so Poochi. Then they say that he was so faithful to the pitch that, like the bee, the drone of the bee, he never wavered from his pitch, so he was called Poochi Iyengar. So there are three explanations given.
The last question is, what's your take on Carnatic music in the IIT campus under Madras? The open air theatre humorously does not have as much mosquitoes as Kalakshetra.
I have sadly not heard a performance there, though I have come to IIT Madras for that beautiful small auditorium that you have. I don't remember its name. That is a great venue in which I have heard performances. I have not heard. I have not come to this open air venue in the in IIT, so I don't know about it. The Central Lecture Theatre. That is the one where I have attended concerts. I like that place very much. But interestingly, the music college, Brodie's Castle, has an open air theatre inside its campus, a huge one. It's almost like a Roman Colosseum kind of thing. And it's never used. I wonder why. Because that place is so beautiful. It's full of trees and there is no surrounding noise of any kind. You can have a wonderful performance over there, but it's not used. I think we are so used to a closed door venue.
Thank you, sir. That was one of the last questions. We now open the floor out. So, if anybody is willing to ask a question, you may please unmute yourself and ask your questions.
There are perhaps no questions, Sriram.
Thank you, Tara.
Um, I just want to, there is nothing further to add to this extremely, what should I say, well researched, and as always, in an entertaining format that only you can present, and keep audiences, riveted to their seats. But I was nostalgic about Rashikaranjani Sabha for two reasons. Because that was the place to go to when I was a child of 9, 10, whatever it is. And one event that comes, I remember, is Bala Saraswati dancing there. And I had an aunt who used to live with us. And perhaps she was not the, what should I say? She was, I would have never considered her as being sensitive to art. But I still remember when Bala Saraswati danced Krishnani Begane then, my aunt had tears coming out of her eyes. So, irrespective of the lighting, I remember the colored lights that were used there, and how lights used to be switched on and off between items. But there was something about that place that really moved people, and it was nice to hear you also, sort of say that. And the second thing, of course, was the little tuck shop there used to sell the best badam and cashew and this thing, which was available only there. So that was one thing. But the other thing was, not many years ago, maybe about 10 years, 12 years ago, Lal Gudi was performing on 1st of January in Mylapore Fine Arts Club. And it would start promptly at 9, and the audience wouldn't want to leave at 1:30 in the afternoon. So I think it's also depends on the, the performer and how they keep the audience together. And so I think it really, it said a lot about the performer and also the accompanists of the performer. So people looked forward to that.
I agree, because I would say that, Sanjay Subramaniam now performs on the 1st of January at 2nd of January at Brahmagana Sabha each year. And that again is now a concert that appears to have any end, because it starts at 10 and then goes on. And there are audience responses and requests and things like that. And the concert just keeps going. So even in our time, yes, there are people artists who are able to gather that kind of,
Respect
yeah,
and appreciation.
yeah.
Anyway, I think it's 8:10, Sriram. I want to thank you for
Thanks.
for a lovely evening, and while it is still virtual, I think you brought all these venues close to us and made them vivid, and made us all, at least some of us oldies, remember those times,
Thank
and how nice those places were. And the most important thing, of course, was the noise free atmosphere of the streets. So thank you very
thank
much.
you.
Hope
Thank you.
we hear you again, and all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sriram.
Bye, Sujata. Thank you, everyone. Bye, bye, bye.
Ayyappa.